Hello, everybody. We are here for our Kids Comics Unite industry interview for November. And I have an amazing group of people here. Usually I do industry interviews with one person, sometimes with two people, but this time we have three people, which is super cool. And the reason that I have three people here is because I was reading through a newsletter that I get from the Kickstarter comics category publicist. And I don't always read his newsletters, but sometimes I open them and just skim through really quickly. And there was this one little blurb that he posted about the CLOCKWORK Curandera campaign that caught my eye because I saw Lee and Low, and I'm very familiar with Lee and Low. And I thought, oh my gosh, they did a Kickstarter campaign with the creators, and it's Raul the Third. And David, I'm afraid that I didn't know you. Now I do know you. I've looked you up and everything. But I just thought it was so awesome. So I reached out and I asked, hey, do you think they'd be interested in talking to Kids Comics Unite? And so that publicist put me in touch with Lee and Low's publicist. And then that Shaughnessy, your publicist, put me in touch with all of you. And so that's why we're all here tonight, because I just want to know what the backstory is of this whole campaign. So let me introduce really briefly who we have here. We have Jason Lowe, who is the publisher and co-founder of Lee and Low, which is a medium-sized multicultural children's book publisher. They are the largest multicultural children's book publisher in the United States. And then we have Stacy Whitman, who is an, I don't know exactly what your title is, executive editor, senior editor.
I'm a publisher just of my impact.
Publisher. Okay, so you're even beyond what I said. So you're a publisher of two books, which is an imprint at Lee and Low. And then we have David Bowles, who is an author and a professor of literature. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to say too much more. You guys can introduce yourselves, but maybe we can just start off with talking about the book. And do you have it by any chance? Do any of you have the book?
I'm sure Stacy's got it there on her shelf somewhere.
I think it's upstairs, actually.
Oh, I mean, if you want, I can grab a copy.
Yeah, that would be cool. So maybe David, you can start off by telling us about it.
Sure. So for the I come from deep South Texas. I live on the border with Mexico. My family's lived here for a couple of centuries on my dad's side, the Mexican American side, and curanderas, like healers, shamans, have been a part of my life since I was a little kid. And they always struck me as like almost kind of like supernatural in some way, like definitely heroes. They would, they could cure you, they could give you advice on, girlfriend problems. It was cool having them in your life. And I also have like a huge love of comics and of superheroes and things like that. And just over time, as I moved into writing in my 20s and 30s, I began to like just get this like itch in the back of my mind to someday tell a story that would have a curandera, but doing superhero-y kinds of things. And over time, that evolved into this idea of a steampunk version of deep South Texas and northern Mexico, and a kind of cyborg curandera. And these things were kind of amorphous in my mind for a long time. And then I tried maybe getting them off the ground as an indie for a while with a couple of illustrators, but that didn't quite go anywhere. And then in 2016, Stacy and I were having a conversation about possible projects that I might pitch to two books. And she said, if you've got like a graphic novel idea, that'd be great, because I'd love to see us moving graphic novels. And I was like, now that you mentioned it, I actually kind of
a finished script.
I literally have been working on a script for several years now. So I put together a proposal for her. She liked it, and then I wrapped up the script and sent it to her. And we decided that was a venture we wanted to embark on. So it was a really, really great thing. Jason, did you find a copy of it?
Sorry, I searched the whole office. I couldn't find it.
Oh my gosh, all of us don't have a copy.
I know exactly where mine is.
Oh,
why don't you guys keep talking and I'll find mine?
Sorry, okay. I tried.
Yeah, no, so I was telling them about like the origin story behind the book itself, and about Stacy reaching out to me and asking if there was anything I was interested in pitching to her. But then once we once she bought the script from me, the question was, who's going to illustrate this thing? It was like a 200 to something page graphic novel set in 1865 in an alternate northern Texas, Mexico. It had a lot of references to border culture, to border customs, and all of these kind of like technified versions of, oh look, she's got them. There is in English and in Spanish. And so the question became, who do we get to illustrate this? And on our short list was Raul the Third, Raul Gonzalez. And we reached out to him. He's from El Paso. He's Mexican American, like I am. Like we have a lot of the same cultural touchstones. We both grew up with comics, with Universal Studios horror films, the black and white ones from like the 30s to the 60s. And we reached out to him, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, yes!" And he even did some like
super excited.
Yeah, he was super excited. Some concept art, but then of course the wrinkle was he needed us to wait a year for him because he was in the midst of working on another book, and illustrating is, for those who are illustrators, this very well, it's a long, arduous process, even going at the fastest clip you can. And so since we wanted him, we were like, okay, let's take a year to work on the script, which I am happy we did, because we really found ways to rework the story that made it work even better. So that's the background that got us to where we are today. The book eventually became a trilogy because in reworking the story, we expanded it significantly, and it was no longer tenable as a single volume. It would have been unwieldy. And going with a trilogy allowed us to include back matter and prequel short stories, all this really cool stuff.
So how did Kickstarter come into the equation?
Well, I actually started my entire imprint on Kickstarter back in 2009 as an independent press, and Jason saw some press about it and reached out to me, and that's how I have my job. And so I'd always in the back of my mind been thinking about, are there other ways we can use Kickstarter? We have seen, and we can go into this in more detail later, we've seen other small presses and particularly indie comics creators, but small presses have been starting to use it as a pre-order platform. And the really cool thing about Kickstarter is that they have an audience that isn't necessarily overlapping with our children's book educators audience. And so that was a really great opportunity to find a way to experiment with them in reaching a new audience.
Yeah, and also Kickstarter had reached out to us before we did the campaign, and they always just wanted to work with us on something, and we just really never had the right book, and so it was always sort of out there, and then of course when David's book came on the scene, and it was, we think it's probably one of the first books simultaneously published in both English and Spanish. We thought, oh yeah, we should do something interesting promotionally for it. So all of a sudden this book became the right book, and we went forward with it.
Yeah, I mean, and there were a lot of conversations about like the crossover appeal of the book, and there was a kind of when you're doing something that is this novel, you trying to find a way to take that novelty and build upon it and do something really exciting with it is important. And so if you already have a novel story, a very novel art style, because Raul decided for this book to do something that would look like it could have come from the late 1800s in this alternate universe, art that looks like it came from broad sheets. Yeah, show them some art. It's some amazing stuff. It looks like it could have come from broad sheets from the early 1900s, black and white on like kind of yellowed paper with spot color here and there. So you're already doing something that novel, let's build on that novelty. And so, I mean, Kickstarter was a perfect idea for pre-ordering. And as Jason and Stacy have intimated, reaching audiences perhaps that might not otherwise be interested in a YA graphic novel. And I think it's because of those kinds of efforts. And in the Kickstarter campaign was great. We had like these great like videos, giving previews with the sound and music. It's just a really, really fantastic campaign. And I think this put it in front of a lot of people that wouldn't have otherwise seen it, and may have contributed to the fact that it was eventually, nominated for an Eisner. It got it in front of industry people who might otherwise have said, "Oh, a graphic novel from 2 books and imprint, what's that?" I think it's wonderful, and I can't wait to do the next one. So the next Kickstarter campaign, I think it was really, really fantastic. We learned a lot from it.
So could
Yeah.
you walk us through a little bit of the chronology, like when you decided, okay, we're going to publish this book, and then when the artist came on board, and then when you decided you were going to do Kickstarter, how much planning time it took for the actual campaign?
The
Feels like I was a lot younger.
the editorial side started in what, 2017, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we brought Raul on at the end of 2017. But like David said, he couldn't get started on it right away. And so that process took time of getting the illustrations going, etc. And as we started approaching being able to release the first book, that's when we started really talking with Kickstarter seriously about this project and what it would take. And what's really great about Kickstarter is that they have a comics book person that you can consult with and say, is my project looking good? What should I do to improve it before you go live? And so, they had a great, list of, here's some successful, we went and we looked at what some successful projects on Kickstarter were, what those components of the campaign were. And Jason can speak to this a little bit more on the marketing side, because from there on, that process was our marketing and publicity department.
Yeah, no, and really, like when you do a campaign on Kickstarter, it's almost like several projects in one, because we had to come up with a good like book trailer video, which we actually succeeded. It was very nice, and then we also had to design and print stickers, for giveaways, and then we had to plan and implement stretch goals, as well as pledge tiers, and then which consisted of book bundles plus donations to underfunded schools. We had to be communicating with the Kickstarter community with timely, updates of how things were going and where we were at. And then finally, when we were funded, we had to distribute, the books and bundles to the generous backers. So it was like, these are all things that we regularly do, just not all at once, and so it was very fun, to sort of be part of this community, which is so much into supporting creators and basically new work, and for us, it was like, it's just like, as Stacy was saying, it was sort of a chance to reach out to a very enthusiastic community, which is a little outside of where we usually go, since our reach is usually to the school and school library market. So it's very, very different for us, but it was a great experience. Yeah.
And those of you who dabble or follow or support indie comics are probably aware that a lot of indie comic creative teams use Kickstarter as like the primary way that they fund and distribute their projects. And so, it's this really interesting world that I hadn't really gotten my feet wet in, but it was really fantastic to see how very quickly comic fans embraced the project and supported it, and helped us reach our goals pretty quickly. Because there's just like an understanding that it's really hard to compete with DC and Marvel, or in traditional publishing, with the big five and their graphic novel imprints. And so you do everything you can. You use every tool at your disposal to get the word out about the project you're trying to put in the hands of readers who will find joy in them and benefit from them. I see Kickstarter, working with some of the big five publishers as well. So this is not something is odd or unusual. It's just smart. You look around, you're like, what can I do to get the word out about something? And
Exactly.
get more people. And you you have to be willing to do basically like whatever. I don't we haven't gotten to the point where I need to go stand on the streets with like a placard on me with like the book cover on one side and like the publishing details on the back.
Soon, David, soon.
Yeah, but yeah, this is just trying to get the permits all lined up.
That's right.
I think it's important to remember that the way that indie people approach a Kickstarter project is very different from how a publisher approaches it, because we have the funding to do all of our printing and all that kind of stuff. We weren't trying to raise money to do the project at all. It was already in process. It was just a way to reach a new audience and try out new ways of getting those pre-orders and doing something special. Because like, I think that especially being a smaller publisher, people might be like, wait, did you need to do a Kickstarter? That's not what it's about for us. It was about reaching a new audience.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just like when you're looking around, you're like, okay, so what new social media platform is out there that we can get the word out? Like, it's just one more of multiple constantly evolving and multiplying tools that you use to get the word out, because audiences are frankly getting more and more niche. And if you want to tap into those, you need to be conversant with whatever platform they're getting their information from. And it used to be you could just put a couple of ads in a couple of places and everybody in the US who had purchasing power would see those. And now it's obviously not true. It takes really careful consideration to get marketing accomplished in this day and age. It means everybody pulls out all the stops and uses every available channel.
Yeah. And also, like, I've been in marketing for a while, and when I started, it was all about just taking an ad, a print ad, and putting it in magazines, and then basically hoping for the best. But there was no analytics. There was nothing to look at in terms of, is this doing anything? You were just hoping it did. But now there's a lot more tools, and for us, as Stacy was saying, it wasn't about, the book was never in danger of not getting published, but for us it was like, can we expand and do a much bigger print run? Can we basically raise money to send David to different schools and get books for all of the kids in the classrooms and things like that? So it was more like those types of things that stretch a company our size, and did help out, in terms of gauging excitement.
Yeah, and frankly, Jason, like some of the things that we did, even the big publishers are seldom doing anymore, except for like they're really like they're best-selling authors, whatever. So this thing that Jason mentioned about getting books into schools, border schools, low socioeconomic status, large Mexican American populations, getting the books in Spanish into the hands of students who are immigrants or struggling ESL students or whatever. That was, that speaks to the socially conscious part of the work that we're doing with Leon Lowe and the publications. And I mean, to me, that was one of the most compelling elements of the campaign, was just, having that opportunity to go, not charge a school for the visit, get them free books, and just, that's a difficult thing to pull off. You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars potentially, and getting it done this way was really, really smart.
Yeah, and also to the thing is, Kickstarter is sort of like, it's a story within a story within a story. It's like we have this book that we're talking about, but then it's the story behind the book and how it was made and what led up to that. And then it's also the story of, like what David was saying, was like, can we actually get, boots on the ground type of thing and get the books into kids' hands? And that kind of speaks to the activism of the kind of book publishing that Leon Lowe does.
One thing.
This is Stacy, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking, one thing that I love about Kickstarter when it comes to comics is that comics are so visual, and Kickstarter makes it easy to be able to share the visuals. So that was the only thing I was going to say.
So I actually wanted to piggyback back off what you just said, Jason. I wanted to zoom back a little bit and talk a little bit about Lee and Low as a publisher, because you are so innovative and different. And I'm not sure, probably some of the people on this call know Lee and Low, and there might be some people who actually don't know Lee and Low. So it'd be really great if you could tell us a little bit about how long the publisher's been around and how it's evolved.
Yeah, no. I mean, I would say that probably very little people have heard of us. We're not a household name. And oh, okay, there you go. I'm wrong. But the thing is, though, is like what I like to say is like Lee and Low is not the name, it's not the face, it's not really the part that has to be famous. It's the books themselves, you know. And so I mean, our story goes back to 91 when we were founded, and we were essentially born from a need, because basically back in the early 90s, only about 10% of the books that were published each year contained any kind of diverse content whatsoever. So there was very little, if no representation back then.
It
And
wasn't
so,
necessarily high quality either.
right. It's pretty schlocky stuff. And so we sort of were launched from that position. And our mission is simple. It's really to publish books about everyone and for everyone. And so so what's cool about the mission is that it's not very set in stone. It's kind of deliberately inclusive, like almost you know, it's just like pretty open-ended, I would say. And that sort of makes it nimble enough to be able to adapt to the changing times, as well as allowing us to sort of plug any gaps, you know, in the list that we discover along the way. So, you know, for us, I mean, this type of publishing approach has led to, you know, a lot of firsts. We've published the first trans picture book called How Aiden Became a Brother. We also published the first book that took place in a Japanese internment camp called Baseball Saved Us. And then the first graphic novel that focused on the Black Lives Matter movement called I Am Alfonso Jones. You know, so
Look right up here. There's a poster from Alfonso right up
yeah.
here. I'm not sure if you guys can see that.
Yeah, so it's been quite a ride. I mean, we really get a thrill out of breaking new ground editorially.
David, maybe you could talk a little bit about your journey as an author, since you do many things.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said earlier, I'm from Deep South Texas. I'm from an area where historically not a whole lot of authors have like just burst from the soil of Deep South Texas and risen to national prominence, you know.
Until recently.
not until recently, yes, there you go. So, but it is a place where storytelling is definitely a part of the everyday fabric. In like local historians and oral storytellers are super important, and a lot of families have those. So I grew up in a family of storytellers. My grandmother Garza, who was like the matriarch of the family, regaled us with stories from the time I was really little, and you know, we were inculcated with this desire to hear stories and tell stories, that for me ended up meaning that I learned to read at an early age because I was very annoying and always wanted more stories. And my family was kind of fed up, and my grandmother was like, "Look, you know what? I have no more, se me acabaron," as we say in Spanish. They're all gone. I have no more. So if you want more stories, you're going to have to learn how to read. And so I bugged my mom to teach me how to read, and I started reading at an early age, and dropped out of kindergarten and just would go to the library every day, because in kindergarten they're barely teaching them the alphabet back in 1975. But it was that, like, going to the library every day that just like made me fall in love with books in a way that perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise, and put me on this really interesting course of like reading well above grade level for most of my school career, and ending up being the first person in my family to go to college. But along the way, one of the things that was missing, one of the things that kind of hurt, was the fact that in none of the books that I read, and I read hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of books, were there any Mexican Americans? And the Mexican American culture just was never represented. And my mom was white, and so just over time, I kind of resigned myself to the fact that only people like my mom and my grandparents on her side were going to be in the books that I read. There weren't going to be people like my dad and my grandmother back then, and the people on the Mexican American side. And it's kind of a disheartening conclusion to reach, but it's just, by the time I was a teenager, like, I guess if I'm going to go to college, then, that Mexican American part of myself is irrelevant. So it wasn't until I got to college and read Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street, and get this, in a world literature class of all things, not in American literature, of course, even though she's a U.S. Chicana from Chicago. That I was like, oh snap! Wait a minute, there are Mexican Americans writing books. Not a whole lot of us, but there are, and they're being taught at college. So this is something important. And it was, I had fallen in love so much with books and with poetry and so forth that I knew that I wanted to write. But I would just assume that I was going to have to write in that canonical, literary tradition, and do some kind of Hemingway-esque kind of thing, maybe set on the border. But when I realized that I could do something else, and that kids nowadays had more options, I decided to become a teacher. And in the classroom, I would address these kinds of things by trying to bring in as much as I could, but also writing my own versions of the stories I'd grown up with as short stories, including lots of literary elements and so forth, and teaching my students to do the same thing. And their excitement about that, the way their eyes and hearts and minds opened up, and they saw our community as full of stories that deserve to be told, and that saw themselves as readers and writers who could do that kind of work. I was hooked. I knew this is what I wanted to do. And eventually, over the course of 10 years or so, I wrote enough of those kinds of stories with my students to have a collection of them that eventually became my first book. And I just kept going forward, never looking back. And I started out, publishing with indie presses and university presses, small presses, and now I publish with a host of different things. Wherever the project makes the most sense is where it goes. There are a lot of us doing the kind of work that needs to be done, of providing authentic representation, not just to the kids whose communities have been excluded from publishing for 100 years, but also for readers outside of those communities who need to see the people in that community represented as real human beings, and who can learn so much about what it means to be a human being by looking at the specifics of a community. I really believe, and I almost feel like I beat a dead horse because I talk about it so much, that the universal rises from the specific. And so writing about the specificity of my own heritage and community and geographical location and its roots in Mexico and in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, I think that does a lot of good for young people of all stripes, and for for adults as well who happen to read the literature. And we need a lot more of it. And as Jason talked about a while ago, it was just 30 years ago when there was essentially nothing. That 10% he described, half of it was being written by people who weren't from those communities of color, and that's why Stacy's comment that it wasn't very high quality is absolutely true. It wasn't authentic. And now we've really had a sea change. We still have a ways to go, but we're in a good place. And a lot of it has to do with the work of groups like Liam Lowe and Two Books, and other people who have waded out into these very deep and turbulent waters of publishing to try to fight the good fight. So I'm super delighted to be talking to you guys about this alongside Jason and Stacy, who have both just done incredible work and published some amazing books that I'm proud to have my book stand alongside.
Wow, thank you for that rallying cry. I love what you said about how the universal arises from the specific. I think that is so true. That's sort of at the heart of literature and art, I think. Yeah. So I'm going to be turning it over to questions very soon. So everybody here, if you have questions, be thinking about what you want to ask. But I wanted to actually turn it over to Stacy for a moment, because you said something that I thought was so cool. I didn't know that about you, Stacy, that you had your own publishing company, is that right? And that
Yeah.
you were starting on Kickstarter, or you were launching
Yeah, it was
projects
very
on
short-lived. So
Kickstarter? Okay.
you guys remember 2008 and the whole economic downturn of it. I had been laid off from Wizards of the Coast. So you guys are comic book people that's very D&D adjacent at the very least. I used to work on fantasy novels for kids at their Mirrorstone imprint. And I was laid off, and I was doing a weekly anime night with a friend, and I just expressed how I really wanted to read the light novel from Japan that the anime was based on. And my friend was like, let's start a small press and we'll translate it ourselves. And I said, I think that is a crazy idea in the middle of a recession. And we actually went to the Small Business Administration and started looking at numbers. And I thought, at the same time, if you guys remember LiveJournal,
Mm-hmm.
long before all the Twitter blowups, there was a thing called Race Fail 09 in 2009. That was basically the first We Need Diverse Books movement, in which adult science fiction and fantasy fans said, this is just unacceptable that there are so many racist adult fantasies out there. It was in response to one particular white woman with a black slave in a fantasy world, so that makes it okay, and it wasn't okay. But I was thinking, if I were in-house somewhere, I could, as the editor, I have the choice to be able to say, this is what I want to publish, this is what I don't want to publish. And of course, other people are part of that decision, but as the editor, you're one of the gatekeepers making those kinds of decisions. And so I thought, I really could do this if I had the money to do it. And that's where the Kickstarter campaign came in. This was like early days of Kickstarter. Like, you had to have an invitation to run a Kickstarter campaign. And I set my sights fairly low because I wasn't sure if it was going to work. We only set us a goal of about $10,000. These days, you guys have probably seen the Brandon Sanderson campaign from earlier this year. What, $27 or $28 million pre-order for 4 secret novels that he won't even tell you what they are. We can talk about the implications of that at some point, but so it was a successful campaign, and the most successful part about it was that Lee and Lowe saw what we were doing and said, it might work better if you come out here.
Well, remember I called you, and I was like, just call her, right? And I picked up the phone, called her, and you were like, all like wigged out. You thought like I was going to tell you to like cease and desist or something like that.
They had been at it for so much longer, and I was just like this editor who I'm a white kid from Illinois who grew up on a farm. I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to diverse books, but I thought, as an editor, I could do something. And so I thought, well, I guess I'll do something. And Lee and Lowe had the experience and the knowledge that made it truly be successful.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, we built that imprint from the ground up pretty much. So
it was a lot of work.
It was a lot of pivots, let's just say. But we got it to work though eventually.
Oh my God! I'm in the midst of my foray into being a publisher of comics myself, and I'm suddenly like feeling all the pain of all the people that I've been impatient with over the years. I'm like, oh no, poor Stacy and Jason and all these other folks. This is it's a lot harder than it looks. Oh my gosh. Yeah, but that Brandon Sanderson thing. I have respect for Brandon. He's a good writer and a decent human being. But when I compare what he's chosen to do with his money and his fame to like what Rick Riordan is just chosen to do, or what Adam Gidwitz has chosen to do, or these other rich white dudes who take that their literary success and turn it into a way to fight the inequities in publishing and to lift up the voices of people whose communities have been underrepresented and who just kind of like need a leg up into the industry, because gatekeeping is still, despite all of the changes that have occurred over the past 30 years, gatekeeping is still pretty intense. And I just wish, and have conveyed this message through multiple people who know him, mutual friends of ours, that Brandon would consider doing something. I think that he would be better served. I know that he's super prolific, so am I. But there's a point at which that stops being an excuse for just having like gluts and gluts of money and not doing anything socially responsible.
Well, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and this is more on the publishing side of things rather than the equity side of things. That if you're a creator thinking about doing a Kickstarter campaign, that I think that would be a very interesting conversation about how he has built what he's built. Because it's not just Brandon doing it all by himself, because he's created a company and is employing people. He's got co-writers now that are he's kind of becoming the James Patterson of his generation.
Oh, dear God.
Like that kind of
So, I don't even know how to respond to that. But yeah, I mean, he has.
He's an old college friend of mine, so I'm not gonna like get into anything like about that kind of stuff, but like
absolutely.
I do appreciate that on the equity side of things, Rick Riordan is definitely doing something really forward thinking. Yeah. And I don't think that everybody is thinking about things in that way, but I do think that if you are a comics creator thinking about how do I use something like Kickstarter, it would be very interesting for you to look at Brandon Sanderson's Kickstarter as a study in not how do I do a multi-million-dollar Kickstarter campaign, but how do I build something over the course of many years that might culminate in something so cool. Does that make sense?
I sort of wanted to segue a little bit, Jana. I just keeping an eye on time here, and I just wanted to sort of share just some very kind of logistical sort of tips from running a Kickstarter if you haven't done it before. And I just sort of made some notes here, and it's just you sort of have to be aware of kind of what the publishing landscape is like right now in terms of manufacturing and production, because the industry's gotten hit very hard, by the pandemic in the last 3 years. And so we've experienced like a spike in material costs, a shortage of supply, the supply chain issues you keep seeing, hearing about in all different levels. That's definitely affecting us in terms of rocketing the cost of all of those things. Yeah. And then unprecedented delays as well. So if you do set up, a campaign, definitely when you're coming up with a funding amount, take all those things into account, because everything is going to cost much, much more, and be incredibly like honest with your pledgers, because there may be delays and you got to let them know. Like, don't like hedge your bets and think, oh, I'm going to get this thing in early. You're not going to get it in early. It's going to be very late. So sort of put those things in and factor them into your campaign. And then lastly, just another logistical thing is that like we're a professional publisher, so we have a warehouse, and any orders that come in, we have people who pick, pack, and ship those orders, right? But if the orders are coming in to you, you have to sort of look around and say, can I free up a garage? Can I free up the guest room? Do I have room for any of this? Or is my spouse
I need to get a
my spouse going to kill me, if I don't, and factor in the cost maybe of a storage unit so they don't kill you, so there's that as well. But it's just sort of like, as I was thinking back on when we ran this back in 21, I was like, ooh, like I would wish people would, share these types of things with me. Yeah.
One thing that I've noticed with my friends who have run these, and I know a lot of people who have run various campaigns since 2010. Howard Taylor is a great example. He runs Schlock Mercenary, if you guys know that one. He's gone from running a webcomic to running a webcomic and doing books based on those webcomics, and then doing a whole gaming system based on the world of those webcomics. And each time he's used Kickstarter, the campaign has gotten bigger and bigger, and their garage and his wife are the people that I'm thinking about when it comes to that kind of fulfillment issue, because she was the one that was running that whole thing, and she was happy to do it, but there was a certain point at which their garage would literally not fit the books that they needed to fulfill, because it was getting big enough that they needed to employ people to do it. And they eventually got a storage unit, but then eventually they actually figured out, we're a publishing company, let's get a warehouse, let's actually run this like a publishing company. So there's a certain point at which you go from, this is my, my side hustle, to this is my hustle, to we're a company and we have to treat it like a company and employ people to do the fulfillment. So those are the kinds of like scalability kind of things that you have to think about when it comes to publishing anything yourself. But if you're thinking about Kickstarter, and Kickstarter is, what's nice about Kickstarter is, as they've become more mature as a company, they have created partnerships and tools that help you to be able to do that kind of fulfillment.
What was the name of the creator?
Howard Taylor, Tayler.
Okay.
And the webcomic is Schlock Mercenary.
Schlock Mercenary. Okay, gotta look that up. All right. Well, I want to turn it over to the crowd here. Who has a question for the team? Samantha? And then
Yes.
Gibson.
If anyone has a question about Kickstarter, they should probably go first, though. My question is more about the diversity side of things. Is that okay? You guys ready? Okay, so I've been a member of the SCBWI for over 10 years now. And one of the things I find happening often in critique groups for manuscripts, especially, is writers that look like me are wanting to, out of the goodness of their heart, participate in helping their characters be more diverse, but they're missing really simple, key, tiny details that would really give it the authenticity it needs to actually do what the goal is. And I don't know what to say to set them on the right track for that. If anyone has any advice on like,
I mean,
how to handle that.
Go ahead.
I think that doing your research, spending time, maybe taking a class. There's a really great organization, Writing the Other, Nisi Shaw and Bradstreet and a couple other people who give classes, online classes. They have a book out with all kinds of tips about like, when you're writing characters who are not from your own lived experience, what are some of the things, some of the pitfalls, some of the things that you do to make sure that you're addressing those, addressing them as full individuals with a heritage perhaps that's different than yours. Ultimately, like if this is what happens when you live in a community that like isn't diverse, and then you want to write about a community that is diverse. I mean, frankly, it's tough. This is why I recommend that people follow people who are not from your cultural background or not from your racial or ethnic background on social media. Spend time with those people in the real world. If you want to write about, even if they're presumably secondary characters who are not from your own lived experience, make sure you have an understanding of what that experience looks like before you inadvertently do harm, especially writing for children, because I mean, you can do some significant harm if you poorly represent kids and then you damage their view of themselves or their understanding of their representation of literature, like that. So, I mean, it's something that can be done. It takes work, like anything else in the world that matters. And I don't know if anybody has something else they want to add to that, but.
Yeah, I was actually going to recommend Nisi's classes as well. She's actually one of our authors. Her first middle grade novel is coming out in February from us, Speculation. But let's take a step back from that, because what I want all of our writers, and I wish that SCBWI had more programs generally that helps helped writers to come to this point of asking, is it your story to tell? Because, and Cynthia Leidick Smith is a great author who I'm quoting constantly, and she posed the question years ago when I was first starting 2 books. She's like, especially when it comes to Native American, because especially when I first started, I would go to the SCBWI conferences, and I would get middle-aged white women wanting me to critique their Native American fantasy story that was basically all stereotypes. And it sometimes comes from a good place, but it also comes from a very privileged place. And that means that it comes from a place that, while your heart might be in the right place, I want you to be thinking about impact over intention. I want you to be thinking about who is reading this and what they're getting from it. And Cynthia Leidick Smith said, have you held enough of their babies? Do they trust you to hold their babies? And that is a really great way of framing the question of, are you in community with the people that you're writing about? Because if you're not in community with them, why are you writing about them? And how can you expect to get it right? And I think that step back really helps the writer to be thinking, okay, so if I can't write, if I can't do it from a writing perspective, what should I be doing? And I want white writers especially to be thinking about, I would love for everyone to read All American Boys by Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiley, because that is a really great example of a white writer writing a white character, examining these issues from a whiteness perspective rather than trying to write from somebody else's perspective. We have so much to add to the conversation and to interrogate ourselves as white people that we haven't really done enough of. And I want us to do that more. And that's where, the last 2 years, not just the pandemic, but thinking about what we have been calling in the media the racial reckoning, I don't think there's really been enough of that on the part of white middle-class America. And I think that there's a lot of room for storytelling that engages, and you'll still have to have, sensitivity readers, and you'll still want to consult and make sure that you're in community with the people that you're writing about, who might be secondary characters, who might be impacted by what you're writing. But take a step back, take a Writing the Other class, because I highly recommend them, whether you're writing main characters or secondary characters, and be thinking about, what kind of story can I tell that is my story to tell, that contributes to this, and then be uplifting writers of color, because that's another way to be in community with each other.
Yeah, and also be open to kind of learning about this. I mean, I've been doing this 25 years, I guess, and I never ever consider myself an expert on diversity publishing, because, every time a new manuscript comes in, I mean, it usually just blows my socks off that how do I not know anything about this? Or how have I never heard of this person? And for me, it never ends, so it's a process, and you sort of have to get used to being uncomfortable. But for me, it's also about just being in that simple, constant state of just being open to learning new things. And I think it just makes it more exciting that way. For me, it never gets old, that's for sure. Yeah.
One of the best parts of being an editor is that I get to be a lifelong student.
Yeah.
I know that we definitely needed, we did sensitivity reads on Witch Owl Parliament, because even though the main characters are like I am mestizo, both indigenous and European blended together, there are purely indigenous characters as well, secondary characters, and we wanted to make sure that we got that right, and we got some really good feedback and made some adjustments. And I mean, you just you just have to know that you're not going to get it right. If you're writing, you have a secondary character who is an astronaut, you are going to go talk to some freaking astronauts if you don't already know them, And so if you have secondary characters that are going to be Black folks and you're not Black, then you clearly need to talk to some Black people about what you're writing. I mean, it's not that freaking complicated. I don't know.
Yeah. Years ago, I never liked the term sensitivity reader. And I tried to coin a phrase a few years back, and I was calling them targeted expert readers, because sort of it captures what David was saying. Is it's not about, well, for me, it was never about sensitivity. It was just about being accurate, and that's really the whole thing. Is when you get a secondary reader, they're an expert in whatever it is you're wondering if it's right or not. And so you don't want to get caught out, not basically in print, showing that you don't know what you're talking about. So that's why you would basically get folks like that, so.
Better to catch it in the editorial process, the writing process, than to have it out there in print and have somebody go, whoa, this really is hurtful. That makes everybody feel awful when you realize that something is out there that has hurt someone.
Yeah, or it's unrealistic, or it's not accurate, and then it takes the person out of the story,
Yeah.
and that's really what you don't want to happen when someone's reading your book.
Other question? Didn't Gibson have a question?
Yeah, I think so. Gibson?
I apologize for this question. What scares you most in the coming path? And I guess I would have to stress in the publishing industry specifically. What's the scariest thing that you either see coming or don't know if it's coming?
Yeah, well, for me, the scariest thing is not knowing whether the very vocal minority of people in certain communities who are trying to get books kept out of classrooms and school libraries will have an influence on what publishers choose to publish and what they put their PR money behind and things like that, and like the implications that will have for writers like me, especially if we are writers who tend to center identities that are typically excluded from those conversations and from those classrooms. Did a little informal polling of people on Twitter the other day, and there is definitely a feel among especially middle grade writers that we're being offered a lot fewer author visit opportunities. Our books are selling a little bit less than they were even during the pandemic. It's just an awkward time where everybody's kind of on tenterhooks about what the political climate is going to mean in terms of whether those voices are once again elided from the national conversation, and those books, or not. I mean, I know that Lee and Low is going to continue in the good fight, and there will always be people like them championing these voices. But if the big five begin to turn away from that, it could have a really deleterious effect on literature in the U.S. and on the education of an increasingly diverse pool of children.
We are almost majority right now. We are majority minority. It was a couple years ago when we hit 5-year-olds being majority minority. So I guess that we're up to 8 or 9-year-olds at this point. In the public schools, we're majority minority. But what David is talking about relates to one of my fears is that what is happening politically, the personal is political and the political is personal. That kids are going to lose access to, I have great confidence that we're growing as a company. We're seeing our books going into places that they've never been before. That gives me a lot of confidence and a lot of joy. But seeing these new policies coming, the censorship and such, that does make me worried about what that means for us, just generally to have an educated populace in the future and having kids have access to those kinds of things. So, the best that I can do, the thing that I have control over is getting those books out to the people who need them.
Yeah, I echo basically David and Stacy's fears. because we've kind of been through this before, where essentially we would sort of have the books, and we would come up against people who were basically pretty overtly against having them in their schools and things like that. And so we're used to pivoting. So we would basically talk about other things about the books other than lead with the diversity aspect, and it was a way to get it in the back door, basically. I don't feel proud of that. It's a little disingenuous, but sometimes, I'm a pragmatist when it comes down to it. The ends justifies the means, and so it is something that we have done and we have seen before, not to this degree, of course. This is pretty off the charts, I would have to say, but we would be thinking along those lines. I mean, when we went so far as to take it off all the business cards and stationery and everything like that. So I've definitely seen it and lived through this before, but this could be something a little bit more than I've seen, at least, but it does ring sort of familiar for me.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I fear that many people in publishing are treating diversity and inclusiveness as a trend instead of our reality. Our lived reality and the way that we move forward as a people is understanding each other. And I think books have such a great potential for helping readers to learn empathy, whether you're talking about children, which is, what I do, or adults, in coming to understand each other and see a different perspective. And I have seen over the course of doing this job, it's been 12 years now. I went in very overly optimistic and have come to really understand, all the various complexities of this conversation as I've, figured out how to do my job. And again and again, I see people from other houses or agents say, "Oh, this diversity thing, this new trend of diversity," and it's not a trend. It's just, let's include everybody. That's just the way it should be.
All right. Well, Stacy, I guess that was a beautiful note to end on. I was gonna say, I want to shift this conversation so we can leave, feeling, I don't know, feeling a bit of joy and hope in our hearts. So thank you for ending in that way. So if everybody could, Gibson's laughing at me. He always laughs at me. If everybody could unmute.
Because you're shading me.
If everybody could unmute yourself and say thank you. Jason, Stacy, and David, who's not here, he had to jump off, but
Thank you.
So great.
Thank you so much.
This was very good.
Thank you very much.
Enlightening.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Really wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Janet.
Bye.